Michael, so thank you so much for joining me today on an N of One. You and I have known each other a very long time. Uh,
Yeah.
I like that you are in full Archangel mode today. Ah. Um, I'm so excited to talk to you because you have such a great story. As you know, here on an N and One, the goal here is to share our individual and unique stories. So often, applied behavioral science is about the study of populations of people and trends and norms and averages and medians and means and all the things, right? This is about you and the individual path that you've taken because sometimes an N of One can crack the whole thing open. And so thanks so much for joining me today. I'm looking forward to talk to you.
Thank you, Matt. It's great to be speaking with you again.
All right. So we're going to go all the way back. And I want to talk about young Michael Hallsworth. Like, what is 7-year-old like Michael Hallsworth into? Like, what does he think he's going to do with his life? Like, what is he enjoying in school? What is he spending his time on?
I think I always liked writing and thought I'd be an author. But actually, there's a funny story here where my mother brought back a book of different careers. I think what was she doing? She was doing something to this. She did stuff related to like the equivalent of community colleges in the UK. And I remember that I looked through this book and decided I wanted to be an actuary
Right,
because
an
it's
actuary feels very uh, not that adjacent. How did that? Tell me more.
it just sounded really interesting about like, when people were going to like working out how people were likely to die or how that varied. Um, and maybe also because it was like at the start of the book, who knows? Maybe it's just that I didn't read enough of it. I only got past A, didn't get past A. But I was definitely I was think slightly precocious kid in many ways. Probably slightly annoying as well. I actually know this because I still have my diaries from when I was 10 and 11 and 12, and my colleagues will know that we do this. There's a kind of amusing thing we do in bits sometimes, which is called a potted history, where you have to, explain something about yourself. And everyone does it. And there's a bit of a sort of internal myth now, but because my potted history is basically me reading out my diaries from when I was 11, and they're pretty funny actually. So there's one where there are various ones that are amusing, but one that is relevant for this podcast is evidence that I was already thinking about behavior in society. So I'm just going to read you an entry from when I was 11. And in it, I write, there seem to be an awful lot more joggers and cyclists, especially at night. This could mean two things for each of them. Good, more joggers, more people want to get fit. More cyclists. Cycling is environmentally friendly with no pollution. Bad, more joggers, more people need to get fit. More cyclists, more people need to cycle because the roads are blocked up. So already at that age, I was thinking about why people were doing things and, these public policy issues, maybe. I'm being facetious. It was, I say also a lot of other ridiculous things in this diary, but I just thought that maybe speaks to a common thread throughout my life.
Interesting. I mean, look, we all say ridiculous things when we're young, but that is a very, you are clearly connecting sort of cause and effect in a very particular way, even if it's an 11-year-old way. I mean, did that translate in, as you were like in high school, did that translate into like, oh, I might want to have a career in the civil service or sort of, have an influence on policy? Or as you got older, how did that sort of develop?
I don't think I really knew what I wanted to do at all. I was at that stage where I didn't have to think about any of that. I was very lucky that I could just go to school, find out things I was good at, which were mainly, we did something called A levels at that point where I was 18, and it's like I did English literature, history, and politics, and those are the three I chose. And So yeah, it was more on the qualitative side of it. It wasn't that I was bad at the quantitative side of it, it's just that's not where my real interest lay. And then wanted to do English literature at university, and my real interest was in like, you know, the world of literature and fiction and what that did, and the reading experience, and also the psychology, I suppose, within the characters in literature. So I didn't think about anything in terms of what I was going to do, um, even at the end of university. And now it's very different, where everyone's like got hustling and got three different things on and multiple experiences by the end. But at that point in time, you didn't have to do that so much.
Yes, although there was always that adult question of like, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah.
Uh, and so I'm curious as to your answer, if an adult asked, you know, where was this all going?
Well, at some point, I probably wanted to, I was thinking maybe about being an academic at one point, but maybe that was just path dependency. Probably would have thought about, yeah, civil service, but I didn't have a clear sense.
Mm.
Honestly, really didn't have a clear sense of what I wanted to do.
And when you went to university and started, going through the English Lit program, was it
Yeah.
what you expected? Right? Was it sort of what you had in mind when you had originally enrolled?
Yeah. Loved it.
Loved
It
it.
was. It was. And I mean, they did some ridiculous things like uh, you had a week on the Victorian novel, which meant the the Victorian novel is they're very long generally. So a week isn't very long to read them. So you basically had to choose either Dickens or George Eliot, and then I chose George Eliot and read Middlemarch, Middle and Floss, and Silas Marner in the space of 2 weeks over the Christmas break. So
Okay. I
it's
thought
kind
you
of
meant like
intense.
during the term. I was like, wow, did
No.
you go to any other classes? But apparently not, just Christmas and books.
Yeah, I didn't really go to lectures actually. I didn't find them very helpful, and also they were on in the morning, and I was basically nocturnal at that point.
Got it. So you're saying staying up late doing work, skipping all of your classes.
Yeah, you didn't need to go
Michael,
to them.
you're a success story. Look at you. Did you have a sense as you were going through your BA that you would want to go on to a master's and a PhD at some point, or was that,
Yeah,
sort
kind of. Yeah. Um, I think I decided that that was something I was good at, so I did want to keep going. Um, but the thing is that it would have been in a different space, obviously, compared to the one I ended up in. So I did actually do a master's after my undergraduate,
of,
in something called culture and criticism. I'm not really sure even now what it was, but who knows? It was the first year they ran it, and it was kind of interesting, but also I had to read a lot of stuff that is kind of incomprehensible. And but it was good because you had to learn how to read stuff that was very hard to interpret. And maybe it was all nonsense as well.
and, and what was culture and criticism like? Is that Foucault? Like, what is that?
Stuff like that, yeah. Yeah.
And
Uh,
how did you pick that?
Literary theory stuff, yeah.
Sort of with the dart at the pub? Like, where did that come about as the thing that you were going to decide to get a master's in?
Because it was a new masters, they were just doing it and it sounded interesting. And the alternatives weren't that appealing, I thought, and it also meant that I could stay another year. And some of my friends were doing 4-year courses, so I kind of hung out with them at the same time. So yeah, that was kind of appealing in general.
And then you graduate and
Yeah,
the world floods in. Like, as you finish up this master's, like, what did you think was going to happen?
I thought I was going to do a PhD, and the funny thing, I'll tell you what the PhD was going to be in. It was going to be in detective fiction and high modernism, and why the literary interpretation of the two was so divergent. And I basically said because um, works of high modernism like Ulysses and The Wasteland and whatever give the critic something to do, whereas detective fiction is completely it provides its own unassailable solution and stops any inquiry once you find out. And there was just an interesting question because they both grew up around the same time in the 20s in terms of being popular, but have very different critical reputations. And I tried to explain why, because critics don't like it because it gives them nothing to do, detective fiction. But I didn't get funding for it. In the UK system, you have to get central funding. And so I was a bit like, I think that maybe they decided it was not fashionable enough, or it wasn't the right thing, or maybe it just wasn't good enough idea. Who knows? So then I was like, what am I going to do? I'll go and get a job. And in retrospect, I'm really glad I did because then I got a job and learned a lot more, through doing that job.
And talk to me about, I mean, you're on this path, the path doesn't work out. Was there a disappointment to that, or you just sort of were like, move on?
Initially, yeah. Yeah, I didn't know what I was going to do. It was disappointing. And it's something I've learned in my life as I got older that stuff that you think is really bad can actually turn out to be really good. And that sounds facetious. That sounds kind of like a kind of Hallmark card type trite phrase, but it does also seem to be true because you don't know at the time how things are going to work out. And so at the time, I thought it was really bad because I thought it was the thing I wanted to do. But then it turned out that I learned a lot more by going to get a job and went into a different space, which I think has been much better in the long term and given me more skills than I would have been if I'd just gone and taken the academic path straight away.
And so as you're casting about, as you're going, oh shoot, I got to get a job, were you applying to everything? You're spraying and praying? Like, how are you going about in this somewhat unmoored position of
Yeah, I was applying
figuring
to
out?
quite a few things. And then the funny thing is that uh, what a job came up at Rand Europe. So the Rand Corporation had a European office, um, and they wanted someone to work on culturals, like the arts and culture. And my master's had the word culture in it. It wasn't anything to do with that, but it gave me the opportunity to do an interview. So that was that's the again these funny indirect oblique ways that things work out. And they gave me a job on the basis of the interview, and then subsequently I hardly did any work in the arts and culture space. I went off to do a load of evaluations for like the European Commissions and started doing evidence-based policy stuff. So it's an unusual turn. And if I hadn't, this is the way it used to be, Matt. I remember I found the job in a ring binder in the Cambridge Careers office because it wasn't really at that point even online so much. It was I saw it in one of these like inserts. You print things out and put them inserts into
Sure.
binders. I saw the job in there.
And when you got to the interview, talk to me about like what I mean, the culture anagram was enough to get you into the interview. As you're casting about trying to figure out what you're doing, what were you saying in the interview? I want to work at Rand because
I think some people were quite skeptical about whether it will work. And at one point, somebody asked me to analyze the logo on the mug because I mentioned some stuff I'd done around logos and my masters, and I think that gave. Look, so one thing you learn at Oxbridge is how to bullshit. That's something that's a really good skill. I would say like 80% of what you learn is like also being able to respond on your feet because you have these kind of one-on-one or two-on-one sessions. And so I did quite a good job at bullshitting in about that answer, and I think that impressed them enough to give me the job. That's what I remember anyway.
so what I hear you saying is you Kaiser Sose your interview. You looked at the mug and yeah, there's a logo and we're going to incorporate that into the pitch and off we go.
And
Michael
they asked
Hallsworth,
me.
Kaiser
I think
Sose.
they asked me because they thought I wouldn't be able to say anything like cogent about it, and then I did. Yeah.
Defied expectations. And then how did you end up, they brought you in to do this arts and culture stuff. How did you end up over on the evidence-based side and what was that like? Was that volitional? Was that sort of the way it worked out? Like tell me a little bit about that pivot.
That's where the work was. And so when that's where the work is. That's you give it to some of your new recruits and you see how they do, and it seemed to work out. So then kept going really,
And were
and
you,
got more interested in it.
I was gonna say, were you chuffed about that? About that? When did you sort of realize, hey, this is actually something
I was chuffed to have a job, Matt. I was chuffed to have a job.
fair enough. But as you, I mean, where in this, you were there for, a little over 3 years. Where did you start to feel like, oh, this is something I might want to do in a more fulsome way?
Yeah, quite soon. So I did find it interesting. Like one thing I've learned is you end up, you often end up liking stuff or finding stuff more interesting than you expect when you get into it. That's something I found when I went to the tax authority as well, and I was like, tax compliance, that's the most boring thing. I was like, actually, it really isn't because it's a pretty interesting decision about what people are weighing up and how people feel about these things. So I found repeatedly I've got into stuff the more I've learnt about it, and that's how I felt about the public policy stuff as well. Um, and so yeah, I found it very interesting, like going to like the European Commission. What else do we do? Like some of the big organizations, Department of Health, and actually seeing what the people were like and seeing how they made decisions. That was quite interesting, I thought. Yeah.
And so, did you have a notion then that, like, hey, this might be sort of the long-term shape of my career? Is this
Yeah, I think
sort of
so. Yeah.
behaviorally informed policy?
Yeah, that's right. And what was really nice, Matt, is a couple of months ago I went back to Cambridge, 20 years on, and gave a presentation about my new book. And one thing I'll say is that it also brought home to me how important having a good manager is. Because I had a really great manager in my first job at Rand, a guy called Tom Ling, and he made a big difference. And 20 years later, I went back and told him that. Was still there. And it made me think what a difference it can make if someone is supportive and sort of thinks that you can do things if you're more junior. And so I'm not saying I do that as well as he did, but I always try because I always think about that example he set for me.
And what made you move on from Rand to the Institute for Government? Where you're just this is starting to feel like, oh man, this is something I really want to do and maybe build my career around, and it's going to start to be something that I really want to make a more fulsome part of my life. Talk to me about the pathway from there now that you've made that decision.
So uh, mu David Halpern, who set up David Halpern set up the Institute for Government. He also set up the Behavioral Insights team,
Right.
and he was married to my boss at Rand, and they were setting up the Institute for Government, and they wanted good researchers to come over on secondment to help get it set up,
Mm.
to get research projects going, and I was recommended to do that, and so that was the connection. And then subsequently, I kind of defected and went full time to the Institute for Government. But for a while, I was doing a kind of weird thing of um, living. Well, anyway, I was living in for a bit. I was living in London and commuting to Cambridge, which was fun to see. The train was empty at
Yeah, they
least.
get the reverse commute.
Yeah, yeah.
And what about Institute for Government made you defect? I mean, what about it was sort of lighting you up?
It was a really interesting new thing that was being set up. Um, Now it's pretty well established in the UK. But at the time, obviously, no one it wasn't a thing. But they had money from a very wealthy individual called David Sainsbury, who was also a minister in the government, who was a science minister. And they had this sort of amazing building. In London, the Mall, where the Queen, Buckingham Palace,
Yeah, of course.
it was on the Mall, still is. And so it had its own money and also it had access to quite high levels of government. So it kind of meant you could go and interview the heads of the department stuff. Whereas just, before you might be writing a research report and it gets sent to the middle management. This was a way of actually talking to the people who are running things. And that was pretty interesting. So that was an attractive, yeah, attractive kind of offer, really.
You also at the time, that's when MySpace and other things came about.
Yeah.
What sort of made you get interested in frameworks and wanting to sort of maybe make this a little more scalable and replicable?
Um, I think it was that I was interested in human behavior. I had known all about Nudge when it first came out. I'd known about some of Kahneman diversity stuff before when I was at Rand. Um, and MindSpace wasn't necessarily going to be a framework till we made it one. Um, and I did a lot of work on that report. Like I say that's I did 75% work on that report. And one thing I would say is that the preceding attempts to make behavioral science or say why behavioral science is relevant for government fell into a trap of being really hard to use. And they were just like, here are 40 theories. There was like a literature review, which was very good in its own terms, but it was all like, here's this theory, and then here's this theory, and you can sort of choose one of them. A lot of people have just no, these all highly abstract, and no, I knew they had no capacity to engage with this, as I wouldn't have done if I'd been doing a lot of the job. So the key thing about MySpace was try to make it very practitioner focused and also just boil it down, but not dumb it down too much.
And but why? I mean, you could have kept doing phenomenology. What do you think made you go, oh man, this like I want to do this broader piece because this is pretty early in your career to start thinking about, a lot of people do get to the framework place, but it's, 5, 10, 15 years into doing this thing where they
Yeah.
sort of have enough phenomenology under the belt that they're like, oh, I want to sort of make something that's more replicable. This is early on. I mean, you're in your 3, 4, 5 of your career. What do you think made that pull out?
What made it work, do you think, or what made me want to do it?
What made you want to do it?
Oh, it was just a good opportunity. Like the government commissioned that report, and it was likely to have some impact. So, why wouldn't I do it? And then one thing I've always liked doing is reading a ton of stuff and then trying to work out the connections and work out how to present it in a particular way. Um, as a side note, I think reading it yourself is really important. I was a bit shocked actually when I found out a lot of academics get research assistants to read things and then read. I don't think that's. I wrote a book recently. I read everything myself because one thing I find is that, and I think this is a big problem with AI as well. I think AI is amazing because it can summarize really quickly, but there is also a danger that you end up satisficing a bit or missing stuff because um, some of the really valuable stuff in articles is when the author is like quoting someone else or giving an example in the introduction or discussion, or just the process of reading through it makes you understand something in a way that is not captured by the summary. And so that I've always found that reading the whole thing and then making connections, of course you skim stuff like sometimes, but you're outsourcing what to skim to the AI, and I think that's just a trade-off you need to be aware you're making. But that's something I've always enjoyed, making those connections and seeing the patterns and how try to come up with a formulation of words that is accurate but still intelligible.
Yeah, I think that there's a little bit of your English lit background coming out, that connective piece, that summation piece, that sort of that's additive summation rather than sort of reductive summation. I think
Yeah,
it's a very deliberate, and you are a very deliberate writer. I mean, you are very,
thanks.
throughout your career have been very uh, I've spent a lot of time writing what I would think of as dense, not dense in the sense of hard to understand, but dense in the term sense of like, hey, that's just, to your point, I'm trying to say something very specific in a way that helps you understand it. As opposed to,
Yeah,
typically we have a lot of loquacious writers who, the vast majority of behavioral science books probably could have been half of long, mine included, right?
I like
And
yours.
I like mine too, but it's not, but it could have been shorter. and so I think that there is that depth of sort of additive summation that I think is really important. And this is, so you go to the Institute for Government, and then you start to have these sort of quite a bit much more governmentally focused positions. Talk to me about that pivot into sort of like a more, out of the sort of nonprofit think tanky version of this into the like much more applied government oriented embedded version.
Yeah, that was fun and interesting, and in a way in which you kind of get more opportunity to sort of broaden things out because yes, just being advising until that point, doing the research, and then it's like, can you do something? And so this was around the time that Bit was being created, and there was interest in how could you save money or improve outcomes through applying behavioral science. And so I then went and ran, went to the tax department, ran all these trials in a particular space about how you could persuade people to pay their taxes using large randomized control trials. But I didn't just do that. I basically revised vast amounts of correspondence to make it just easier to understand. Because a lot of the time stuff was written from the perspective of a civil servant implementing a law. So it literally would start with, under the auspices of Section 345 of the 1962 Revenue Act, I am author. All right. What do you ask? Why are you writing to me?
What
What's
is this
going on?
letter about?
Yeah, because it's like, don't start with what is most important to you as the official, what is most important to the recipient. So don't wish to sort of be unkind, but there was just so much stuff like that. And so in general, I also range quite widely in terms of how to help people, how to help people doing an important job understand human psychology as well, and just improve the way that things were set up. So I also did that in that job.
And talk to me a little bit about the push and pull of that, right? I mean, I can't imagine they, with open arms everywhere all of the time, were like, yeah, run all these trials, do all these things, it'll be
Yeah.
great. Like, talk to me a little bit about sort of how you pushed in and where you saw people pull you in.
Yeah, so I think there was obviously like institutional support for it at some level, and there are some key positions where it really helps if you have somebody supportive. So I had someone supporting me who uh, sort of owned part of the system, but also had an open view to ideas from the outside. Um, and he owned enough of the system to be kind of close to it, but not so. But he wasn't so senior that he was distant, but had enough power. And so his name was Nick Down. He was he still is a really creative and interesting official. And so with his support, that's still not enough because then you often are putting requests and requirements on people's time. And they're like, why are we doing this? Because to learn is not one of the objectives of government quite often. Um, you're asked to deliver certain things. You're not asked to understand how well it's working most of the time, which is a sad thing to say, but it's kind of true. So then you just have to be really personally persuasive and saying, and actually do favors. Like if you just come in and you're like, I want you to do this and this and this, you're not going to get very far. And that's why I also proactively tried to help as best I could. So I could be seen as one of the team, not just extractive. And then you've got like more leeway to say to the analytics team, I know you got to deliver this report for your superiors, but I'd love it if you could just like extract this data and run a quick check on it. And that's how things get done.
I think
Um,
there's a lovely point in there about actually combining your 2 points. Often behavioral scientists can feel a little like the tax authority. So I want you to do this for me because this, right? Not from the perspective of the people that they're necessarily serving. And it can feel rather extractive. But it's weird, right? Because rather like the tax authority, they don't think of themselves that way. So it doesn't, as a behavioral scientist, it doesn't feel extractive to be like, do this thing because I'm not trying to get you to do this thing for me. I'm trying to get you to do this thing for science, for better, for, you know. And so there's this sort of weird, well, if you build it, they will come. Because it's good for the system, they will do the thing. But to your point, that's not always how people operate, right? It's hard to see the greater good when you're underwater with a million things. And I'll do things for my friend Michael that I wouldn't necessarily do for the greater good. And so building that rapport, I think, is really key, and something that you were able to do very effectively, as you worked your way uh, through the government. And so there's an alternative universe, Michael, where you sort of become part of the government, and that's the rest of your career, is you sort of become like the minister of something, and then you sort of use behavioral science, but you sort of veer off in this governmental direction. What do you think prevented that? I mean, what do you think made you end up not actually joining the government on a long-term civil service? We're not talking about PM Hallsworth at the moment, and so what do you think steered you away from that?
Well, it was an option, not the political side of it. I just don't think I would have been very good at that. But the administrative side of it I could have done. Yeah. I think because two things. One, my time in a large bureaucracy also made me realize how it shapes your own behavior and how it makes you think that certain things aren't possible. It constrains your worldview, and I felt that was happening. Um, but also the second thing was there was I don't know, like the opportunity to create something um ourselves when Bit was we decided to spin out of government, and that was just a unique opportunity, it felt like. Whereas you could always maybe go back in defeat to the civil service at some point if you wanted. This was an opportunity that wasn't going to come again, and why not take a risk?
Yeah, that's a lovely and well-made point. It's something I think, we've done enough of these that we see some patterns. And one of those patterns really is people being able to tell the difference between like, ooh, this is a unique opportunity versus, I'll probably get another swing at this one eventually.
Isn't there something about that Amazon has that thing about doors and windows, and you can go back through a I can't remember the corporate thing. You can go back through one of them, but you can't go through.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something
Yeah,
like that.
it's one-way and two-way doors, but that's about the reversibility of decisions. I think your point that is really well made about careers is, at this point in my career, I can go get a head of behavioral science job, and I know pretty reliably that those will show up in industries in particular ways. But there are then those unique things where you're like, oh man, like joining Frog, you're like, oh man, I have this one chance to take like the world's sort of most famous design agency and try and pivot it towards sort of a more evidence-based, informed, science-oriented version. And I probably will never get that chance again. Like lots of the other things that I could be doing, going to a big tech company, going back and doing, sort of the things I know how to do. This is a really unique and special thing. So you had this sense that like, ooh, the BIT is a really unique and special opportunity that's situated in time that won't come around again.
Yeah, pretty much. I think so. And yeah, I think also I just liked working with the people
Mm.
in the organization, and it felt like that was quite a talented group of people, and you've got to make a decision on that basis as well.
Yeah, who you work with, right?
Do you have faith in them?
100%. And do you like working with them? And do they make you want to show up? I mean, I think we often undervalue that because it's perceived as uncontrollable. So as behavioral scientists, right? Like we can't control who you work with. And so it's hard to sort of, always put that in the equation. But to your point, I mean, those intangibles are huge. So you go down this BIT path, you start, you sort of become this founding member, help this thing grow. What, talk to me about the transition to the United States and the decision to leave sort of your home market, as it were.
Um, yeah, so I think there was my colleague Elspeth, who co-wrote the Behavioral Insights book with me, had done a great job setting up a bit in the US in 2015, but she was coming back to the UK, and I I know. I just maybe always thought that it'd be interesting to live abroad at some point, live in a different country, work in a different country, and so it was seemed like an interesting opportunity to sort of grow grow things further and do things in different space. Because I think at that point I had, in one form or another, 5 years at Bit, and I'd done quite a lot of stuff, but it was also what's a new challenge, and this seemed like new enough because it was a completely different space, but not completely new.
And talk to me about what did that, as you made the move, what was unexpectedly challenging about shifting markets?
Um, I mean, I don't really have a strong answer to that because it wasn't that challenging in some ways. There was just a time that when I went over there, um, there was a growing market for behavioral science, and so I think in general, I've been a kind of person who's been fairly respectful in terms of listening first to what's going on and being very aware that I don't really know how things are done in different countries. So wanted to sort of understand that first and not make too many assumptions. And so just applying that principle meant that it worked out okay. I mean, there are differences and similarities between the US and the UK, but at the time there was just quite a lot of demand in different spaces, so it things went pretty well. Um, so the challenges were mainly growing quite fast at that point. So yeah,
And that is its own, I mean,
yeah, that is its own challenge.
that is its own challenge. I always
Yeah,
remember when I was a kid, I remember the first time I ever did a stress inventory in like a health class. And one of the items was like parents fighting more. And I was like, yeah, okay, I could sort of get how that would be stressful. But the very next item was like parents fighting less. And I was like, wait, isn't that good? But then when I thought about it, I was like, ooh, that would be weird. If your parents like fought a lot and all of a sudden they stopped fighting, you'd be like, oh shit, that's weird. And so, we talk a lot about the struggle when things aren't working, right? And that absolutely is a struggle and it's stressful, etc. But it is also stressful when things are working at a pace that is really hard to do. Oceans, where I work now, doubles in size every single year, and just keeping up
wow.
that pace and that momentum, is just really, really hard on a lot of people. So yeah, I absolutely can hear that stress, and at the same time, you're adding stress, right? Because you've taken a lot of interest outside of the BIT. You've published papers, you've written books. Like,
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about like your life as a behavioral scientist outside of the behavioral insights team, and sort of how you've chosen to live that more public life.
Um, so I think it's always been quite important that people who do the work can write about it. Because otherwise you just have people whose job is to write about it, writing about it, and they miss things. And so that's why I think that this sort of crossover is really important. And I remember at one point there was like 10 years ago, maybe there was a lot of criticism about applied behavioral science by academics of various disciplines, most of them geographers for some reason. And um, they seemed to almost assume that the people doing this stuff weren't reading their articles. And they certainly never even bothered to get in touch to ask what we were doing. They just preferred to just like read some report of it and then write something about it. And so sometimes I used to email them and talk to them, and they were very taken aback to find out that we weren't people with three heads, and that, oh, look, you actually read academic journals? Yeah, of course I do. And I've thought about many of the same things you've thought about. But I also know that you have to make difficult trade-offs to actually do things, trade-offs you never have to make. So it's always a lot easier when you don't have to make those trade-offs. And I always thought it was important that someone should write to give that perspective, because it's harder when you sort of balance these things and say what it's like trying to do some of the stuff in practice. And it does not mean that you have to be ignorant of the academic side of it. You're perfectly capable of reading that. It's just also do the practical stuff as well. And I think that's equally important. So that's something that always drove me to do that. And also just enjoy the process of writing, frankly. I find it quite fun. So that was the other thing that prompted me to do it, to write the co-write the book on behavioral science with Elspeth and the manifesto, because I mean the manifesto was also because people were constantly asking, what's the future of behavioral science? Like that was the thing you used to get all the time. So rather than me just saying an answer in a session, I was a bit like, I should probably come up with a good answer, you know?
Yeah, I do think there is. I mean, as I sort of said in the foreword to my book, it's motivated by not wanting to answer the same question for the 80,000th time,
Right, yeah.
right? Like there is a sort of a, that maybe, in consideration of your point about waiting for market pull and listening for market pull and listening for what people want from you. If people ask you the same question 80,000 times, you probably should write down an answer because it's probably a question people want answered, right?
Yep,
Uh,
completely.
as
Yeah.
opposed to those sort of, there's lots of one-off questions people ask me that don't merit a sort of larger, more systematic, more structural answer. Uh,
Although isn't it great when someone asks a question that you've both never heard before and is really, really great?
oh
And you're
yeah.
like, wow.
Yes, my favorite by far is, as you know, having worked together with me over time. I do like the M&M thing and stuff. And every once in a while, someone will throw out a promoting or inhibiting pressure that I've never thought of before, and I'm like, yes. And isn't it exciting that after me doing this 80,000 times, there are still factors that we don't think about and factors that could, that's an exciting part of human behavior. And you have sustained now, you and I both had relatively long careers here. You've sustained your interest in this for a very long time. What do you think it is about behavioral sciences that sort of keeps your motor running and not, you haven't gone back into the UK government and you haven't just become a tax, you have not become, unless there's something you'd like to reveal on this podcast, I have not seen you become an actuary yet. So
No, I probably AI is going to eliminate actuaries thinking about it. I never considered this, but vast majority of it is like quite algorithmic. And so maybe it was a good thing I didn't become an actuary because 20, 30 years later, might be in trouble. But no, I don't know for sure. I mean, actuaries may be fine.
and
Why?
behavioral scientists may be replaced by AI. So, who knows?
Well, I don't know. So that's the thing. Like one way of thinking about uh, applied behavioral science is the value add changes. And a lot of the time, I do think that we've overestimated the importance of knowing the stuff. Now, that sounds ridiculous because you can argue that knowing the literature really well is actually a distinguishing factor between someone who knows what they're talking about and someone who's just read one of the pop science books. But I do also think that people have tended to focus on the tools a lot and like the body of knowledge and less on the decisions you make about applying it, which are equally as important. And also, some of which are, I think, highly context dependent and also relevant to individuals. And as a part of that, it goes to the point around personal relationships and getting things done through your personal persuasiveness, which again, we don't like to talk about so much because we prefer to talk about the technical stuff, but is incredibly important and really distinguishes between people who are good at this stuff and not. Because if you think that stuff isn't important, you will fail. So you can see with AI a world in which the codified knowledge is more the domain of the AI, and then the tacit and relational and physical turning up and that kind of thing is more left to the humans, and that is a really important part of the job as well.
It is. And I think, we're in a weird place as scientists because you have to simultaneously acknowledge that it matters at the same time you really wish it didn't, right? Scientists want a world in which, the right answer wins, the right, most evidence-backed answer wins all the time. That's sort of the definition of science. And so it can be uncomfortable to acknowledge that isn't how the world always operates, and that sometimes you have to do things that are not the evidence. I think early in my career, I was quite frustrated by the fact that I'm like, obviously we should do this thing. Like all of the evidence points us in this direction and people aren't doing it, and that would drive me crazy. You know, a lot of being an executive and getting older is just learning to be like, yep, people are unconvinced by the evidence. I will have to find a different way to cause
Yeah.
something to occur.
Well, also you learn very quickly in government that completeness and exactitude, um, they're like you. How do I put this? They're easy and they're controllable. It's not easy, but you can you can write a perfect essay that's absolutely right and has eliminated all the issues. Um, what is really hard is writing a short, comprehensible brief for a busy decision maker that doesn't whitewash everything, but tries to. You've had to make that decision about what to include and exclude, and it's got to be defensible. And I think that puts some people, that makes some people really stressed.
Hmm.
And you don't win a medal by writing a 15-page thesis, um, because that is useless. It's as useless as one that is completely wrong, and because it doesn't get used. And so then you realize quite quickly that the skill is trying to put yourself in the place of your reader, and then getting a formulation of words that isn't wrong but is still meaningful.
Yeah. You know, I sometimes in teaching, I talk about the difference between absolute truth and functional truth. Sometimes the functional truth is enough, right? Like it may not be absolutely precisely, technically, absolute in every possible way accurate, but it is in the direction of accuracy, and it's a hell of a lot more accurate than what we're doing right now. Uh, and that sort of iterative improvement is something that I think tech and applied behavioral science have fed off each other. I mean, we can't leave the podcast though without talking about, you know, you've written framework, structural, manifesto style stuff, but you also have an interest in sort of like very specific topics. So you have a new book out, you know, sort of down a lane. How did that come about, right? Where you've picked a very particular lane that you're interested in, rather than maybe a larger sort of like the next version of the handbook of behavioral science kind of version of things. You know, talk to me a little bit about the new book and how it came about and why it was something that you want to push.
So I think that hypocrisy is actually really, it's only narrow in one sense because I think it's one of those topics that is narrow enough to open up into bigger questions. It's a way into thinking about stuff that matters for us. Um, and the reason why I really got interested in it is because it is different from other. But the last thing I wanted to do was write a pop science, behavioral science book that was the same as every other one, which had all the same examples again, which, if you read a few of them, you get bored to death with. And this is a space of studies that really you never hear about. And yet there are some familiar concepts as well, like cognitive dissonance and sort of like the gap between your words and your deeds, and your intentions and so on. That's a well-known topic in behavioral science. So it's not completely new. And I talk about that bit at the end of the book, how you can be more consistent with your goals. But it's also a topic which allowed me to draw in philosophy, literature, um, psychology, history. And I think that frame of reference is something that I can bring, which isn't always present in a lot of behavioral science books. And so I wanted to, it was also an opportunity to wind things out and show you could look at this issue from multiple perspectives and not just cite academic, not just cite scientific studies all the time, but also, for example, how this part of a book, this part of a novel by Joseph Conrad illustrates hypocrisy in different ways. And I think that multiple lenses on it is what I find satisfying in a book, that broader frame of reference.
Yeah, it's interesting how much of applied behavioral science is about broadening. I think people, you know, I read, I mean, I read journal articles, but I read almost exclusively fiction, right? I don't tend to read nonfiction books and a big part of that is, I think, you can get summarizations and summations and you interact with experts and you learn things from them. But, it's really hard to get the sort of the depth of perspective that a fictional book can bring to you from any other source, right? A summary of Romeo and Juliet is not a very
Yeah,
good version of Romeo and Juliet.
yeah, exactly. It is something that cannot be summarized because it is, Kant said art is purposiveness without purpose. You can't create an instrumental version of it because its whole point is it's not. I mean, look, I'm sort of. I was about to say art isn't instrumental, but it can be, right? It can be as well. It can be didactic. But so anyway, maybe this is like a bigger thing. What is art? Shouldn't really go there because that's very contested.
It'll be a much longer podcast. I'll
Yeah.
save you, my friend. I'll save you. In our last 5 minutes, talk to me a little bit about what's next for you, right? The book is out. You've done the publicity, you've done the touring, you've done the talks. Some of that's still ongoing. But, as you think about where your career grows and goes and this trajectory continues, I mean, what's next for Michael?
Um, Great question. So I'm next week teaching the first class in a new course on AI and human behavior. And about 4 months ago, we put out a big piece of work where I just spent most of the summer reading all the stuff on AI and human behavior and how AI works and so on. So maybe that's not the most unexpected thing, but the unavoidable truth is that AI is affecting lots of people's lives and behavior, and we should understand why and how any issues can be mitigated. Also, how we can take advantage of the opportunities. So that is definitely something I will be looking and thinking about. And I do find it really interesting because if you look at, again, it's one of these places where you make connections, but neural networks, right, are modeled on the brain, and there's what seems to work. There is a view of the brain, like Lisa Feldman Barrett has, and others, neuroscientists, that brain is the prediction machine, much like generative AI is. Uh, so there are, and a lot of the articles trying to improve AI use system one, system two analogy. So that kind of those kind of analogies and connections are something I find really interesting, and trying to make the case of how behavioral science is really relevant to AI, both in terms of human behavior, but also like the overlap with AI behavior. That is something that I find really fascinating right now.
It's certainly a fertile place and connects to, one of the greatest recent hypocrisies for me is all the people who are willing to point out how bad AI is, but not how bad humans are. Uh, the canonical example for me is always mortgage decisions in the United States, right? So who gets a mortgage is quite racist, right? When humans do it, right? We can document the racism. We can extensively sort of point it out. So then people introduce AI and they're like, well, the AI is also racist. And I'm like, yes, that is true, but it is less racist than you are, right? Like the AI is considerably better at reducing bias than any individual human. Uh, but people are so, the standard we hold for technology, starts at the anchor of 100% and works backwards, where, the standard that we set for humans is quite a bit lower and then we work up. Uh, so I think, this combination of AI and behavioral science sits right at that intersection. Is a hypocrisy is a good jumping off point for for looking at AI and humans. So this is a place you want to spend more time and more energy going forward.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think in my career I've generally been not had big plans in terms of like 10-year stuff, but just assess the options that are more immediate and then do what feels right with with reference to certain high level principles. There's a really good book I talk about a lot called Obliquity by John Kay, which he says that is quite a good way of making decisions. And I kind of agree with him. Like you can overthink all this with big plans and that can lead you astray. So, yeah, that's what I'm looking at right now. AI and its pretty interesting.
That's awesome. Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, I love every one of these interviews because they show off sort of the uniqueness of the people who do this work and the wandering paths that get there from the people who sort of, you know, folks like Pete Judo, who had the luxury of being like, do applied behavioral science as an undergraduate, which like did not exist when you and I were young, to folks who like yourself, sort of, they were at a point, they made a decision and, they make the tactical decisions as they go along and it leads them sort of organically to the place. And I appreciate you sharing that story and for staying active. You do a ton of writing, you really help to push the field forward, which is such an important thing. I think doing the work obviously is, there can be no applied behavioral science if we don't do the work, but if we don't write about it, then it doesn't push forward. And I think we're going to have a special episode coming up, which I'll try and get you on about sort of the behavioral science plateau and what skills are needed to sort of take us to the next sort of epochal version of behavioral science rather than maybe the slow increase that we're in at the moment. So looking forward to more conversations with you soon, my friend.
All right. Thank you, Matt.
Excellent.
Take care.